May 4th, 1945. The heart of the Austrian Alps. The air here should be crisp, smelling of pine and melting snow. But today, it is thick with the suffocating scent of diesel exhaust and the metallic tang of fear. On a narrow gravel road winding through the forest near the village of Wörgl, two groups of men are frozen in a deadly standoff. To the left, a column of American Sherman tanks, their hulls scarred by shells and caked in the mud of 1,000 miles of conquest. Standing in the turret of the lead tank, Besotten Jenny, is Captain John Jack Lee Jr. He is 34 years old, a cigar-chewing, whiskey-drinking Texan with a reputation for being as stubborn as the steel he commands. His hand hovers just inches from the holster of his M1911 pistol. His eyes, narrowed under the rim of his helmet, are locked on the man across from him. That man stands 30 paces away, clad in the field gray of the German Wehrmacht. Major Josef Gangl. Gangl is a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who has spent years perfecting the art of war for a regime that is currently collapsing into ash and rubble. On his chest, the Iron Cross catches the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. Behind him, a handful of German soldiers, men who were, until 5 minutes ago, the sworn enemies of everything the United States stood for, level their Kar 98K rifles at the Americans. The silence is absolute, broken only by the low, rhythmic thrum of the Sherman's radial engine. For 3 long years, these two men have been trained to do one thing: kill each other on sight. To Lee, the gray uniform is the symbol of a monstrous ideology that has bathed Europe in blood. To Gangl, the American olive drab represents the invaders who have turned his homeland into a graveyard. One nervous twitch, one misinterpreted gesture, one soldier with a heavy trigger finger. That is all it would take to turn this forest road into a slaughterhouse. But then, the logic of the entire war breaks. Major Gangl takes a slow, deliberate step forward. His boots crunch on the gravel, a sound like glass breaking in a cathedral. The American G is tighten their grip on their Thompsons. Lee doesn't flinch. He watches Gangl's eyes. They aren't the eyes of a fanatic looking for glory. They are the eyes of a man who has seen the abyss and is looking for a way back. Slowly, Gangl reaches out his right hand. He isn't reaching for a Luger. He's reaching for a miracle. Captain Lee looks at the hand, then back at the German major. In this moment, the boundary between us and them blurs. This is the beginning of the most improbable alliance in military history. A story so strange that if it were a Hollywood script, it would be rejected for being too unbelievable. This is the story of the battle for Castle Itter, a day when Americans and Germans fought side by side to save the soul of France from a Nazi death squad. But to understand why these enemies chose to become brothers, we first have to look at the fortress that held the most valuable hostages in the world. To understand why the German major and the American captain were risking everything, we have to look up. Perched on a 660-foot limestone promontory in the Austrian North Tyrol, Castle Itter looks like something plucked from a Brothers Grimm fairy tale. With its soaring Gothic towers, thick stone battlements, and a panoramic view of the Brixental Valley, it is an architectural masterpiece of the 19th century. But in 1943, the SS turned this fairy tale into a paradox. It became Sonderlager Itter, a special subcamp of the notorious Dachau concentration camp. But you wouldn't find skeletal figures in striped pajamas here. There were no gas chambers or firing squads, at least not yet. Instead, the guest list of Castle Itter read like a who's who of the French Third Republic. These were the honorary prisoners, men who had once held the fate of Europe in their hands, now reduced to bickering over dinner seating charts. There was Paul Reynaud, the former Prime Minister of France, a man of diminutive stature but immense ego. Renaud was the fierce anti-Nazi who had wanted to fight Hitler to the last drop of French blood. And then there was his arch-nemesis, Édouard Daladier, another former prime minister, the man who had signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, famously hoping for peace in our time. The tension inside the castle wasn't just between the guards and the prisoners, it was a civil war within the walls. Renaud and Daladier loathed each other with a passion that bordered on the psychotic. They blamed each other for the fall of France in 1940. They refused to eat at the same table. They refused to speak. They spent their days writing long, vitriolic memos in their cells, still trying to win political arguments that the world had long since moved past. Joining them were the military giants who had failed to stop the Blitzkrieg. General Maurice Gamelin, the man who lost the Battle of France, and General Maxime Weygand, his successor, who had eventually called for an armistice. They too lived in a state of perpetual frozen hostility. The castle was also home to Jean Borotra, a world-famous tennis champion known as the Bounding Basque, and Marie-Agnès Caillot, the sister of Charles de Gaulle. Hitler kept them here for one reason: leverage. These were high-value bargaining chips intended to be traded for concessions when the inevitable end came. They were treated with a bizarre, twisted respect. They had a library. They had gourmet meals prepared by a professional cook. They were allowed to walk the courtyards. But make no mistake, this was a gilded cage. Presiding over this surreal prison was SS Captain Sebastian Wimmer. He was a man who knew the tides of war were turning against him, and he took out his frustrations on the VIPs through psychological warfare. The prisoners lived in a constant state of Schrödinger's execution. Every morning they woke up not knowing if they would be served breakfast or lined up against the stone walls and shot. By April 1945, the gourmet meals began to run low. The BBC broadcasts on their hidden radio grew more frantic. The Thousand-Year Reich was dying, and as the Allied armies closed in, the prisoners realized a terrifying truth. To the fanatical SS, they were no longer bargaining chips. They were witnesses, and witnesses to the crimes of the Holocaust were usually silenced. The orders from Berlin were chillingly simple: leave no one alive to talk. As the SS guards began to pack their bags and vanish into the night, the prisoners of Castle Itter found themselves in a new kind of hell. They were no longer locked in. They were trapped out, surrounded by a landscape crawling with fanatical Alpine death squads who saw the execution of French politicians as their final act of devotion to a dead Führer. The castle walls, which they had hated for 2 years, were now the only thing between them and a shallow grave in the woods. They needed a miracle, and they needed it before the sun went down. If you looked at Major Josef Gangl's service record, you would see the perfect German soldier. He was a career officer, a man of the old school who had survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. He had commanded heavy rocket launchers during the desperate retreat from Russia. On his tunic, pinned the Iron Cross First Class and the German Cross in gold, medals earned in the teeth of the most brutal combat in human history. To the SS, he was a hero of the Reich, but as the spring of 1945 arrived, Josef Gangl was a man living a dangerous double life. The war was no longer about victory. It wasn't even about defense. For Gangl, the war had become a grotesque circus of pointless slaughter. He watched as flying courts-martial SS death squads roamed the Austrian countryside, hanging teenagers and old men from lampposts for the crime of defeatism. He saw a regime that was willing to burn its own people to ashes rather than admit the end had come. And at that moment, the soldier's oath he had taken years ago began to feel like a noose. Gangl was stationed in the town of Vergel with a remnant of his unit. But he wasn't just following orders. Deep in the shadows, He had begun a high-stakes game of treason. He had made contact with the O5, the Austrian resistance. Think about the sheer audacity of this. A decorated major in the Wehrmacht, secretly meeting in dark cellars with the very partisans he was supposed to be hunting. He provided them with intelligence. He diverted arms and ammunition. He used his authority to shield the town of Virgil from the fanatical SS units who wanted to turn every house into a fortress. Gangl knew that if he were caught, his medals wouldn't save him. He would be tied to a chair and shot as a traitor before the sun went down. But he had a reason to keep going. He wanted his men to survive. He wanted his town to survive. He was waiting for the Americans to arrive so he could surrender and end the madness. Then, on the morning of May 4th, the kitchen door of his headquarters swung open. Andreas Krobot, the cook from Castle Itter, stood there, drenched in sweat and trembling. He didn't come to talk about rations or logistics. He spoke of French prime ministers, a medieval fortress, and a looming massacre. He told Gangl that the SS guards had fled, but the Death's Head units were circling back. The prisoners, the men who held the keys to France's future, were sitting ducks. This was the moment of truth for Josef Gangl. He could have ignored it. He could have told Krobot that he had enough problems of his own. He could have focused on his own surrender to the approaching U.S. 12th Armored Division. But Gangl looked at his medals, then at the cook, and then at the mountains. He realized that being a good soldier meant nothing if he stood by while innocent people were murdered. He decided to do the unthinkable. He wouldn't just wait for the Americans to find him. He would go and find them. He would offer his sword to his enemy to save a group of people he had never met. Josef Gangl climbed into his Kubelwagen, white flag in hand, and drove toward the American lines. He was heading toward a handshake that would change history, and a battle that would demand the ultimate price. But before he could reach the Americans, he had to hope that his own side wouldn't kill him first. While the world's superpowers were signing treaties and drawing new maps in Berlin, the fate of the French elite rested on the shoulders of two men who weren't even supposed to be there. Two messengers, two paths, one impossible deadline. First, there was Zvonimir Chuchkovich, a 22-year-old Yugoslav forced laborer who had spent 2 years scrubbing floors and hauling coal for the SS at Castle Itter. To the Nazis, he was invisible, just another Untermensch utility. But Chuchkovich had something the generals didn't. He was young, he was fast, and he knew every goat path in the North Tyrol. On the morning of May 4th, under the guise of running an errand for the castle commander who had already fled, Chuchkovich slipped through the gate. He didn't take the road. The roads were death traps, choked with SS patrols looking for anyone to hang. Instead, he went vertical. Imagine the scene. A young man, lungs burning, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, scrambling over jagged limestone ridges. He dodged patrols by hiding in freezing mountain streams. He watched from the shadows as Tiger tanks roared past on the valley floor below. He was heading for Innsbruck, 40 miles away. It was a suicide mission. If a single SS sniper spotted him, the secret of Castle Itter would die with him in the dirt. But Chuchkovich wasn't the only one running. Back at the castle, the prisoners grew restless. They didn't know if the Yugoslav had made it or if he was already swinging from a tree. They couldn't afford to bet everything on one man. Enter Andreas Krobot, the castle's cook. Krobot was 50 years old, a local Austrian who knew the village of Virgil like the back of his hand. He didn't have Chuchkovich's youth, but he had something better: subtlety. He hopped on a bicycle, yes, a bicycle, and pedaled straight into the mouth of the lion. As he rode through the valley, he passed burnt-out trucks and the bodies of deserters. He kept his head down, looking like just another weary civilian trying to find a loaf of bread. But in his pocket was a crumpled note that could get him executed 10 times over. Krobot's destination wasn't the Americans. It was the only man in the region he thought might still have a shred of honor left. Major Josef Gangl. Now, imagine the tension. While Chuchkovich is collapsing from exhaustion near the American lines at Innsbruck, Krobot is whispering in a darkened room to a German officer in Würgl. Two different gambles, two different types of courage. By noon, the open loop was widening. Chuchkovich finally stumbled into the 103rd Infantry Division. He was filthy, babbling in broken German and French about prime ministers and castles. The Americans were skeptical. Was this a trap? Was this a delirious refugee? Meanwhile, in Würgl, Gangl was looking at Krobot's note. He knew that if he moved his troops toward the castle, the SS would see it as open mutiny. The clock was screaming. At the castle, the French prisoners looked at the tree line. They saw movement, not the olive drab of the Americans, not the gray of Gangl's men. They saw the black collars and the silver ruins of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, the butchers of the Eastern Front. They were coming back to finish the job. Would the messengers be enough? Or would the golden cage become a mass grave before the first American tank could even crest the hill? The race was on, and the finish line was a medieval wall that was never built to stop modern panzers. While Major Gangl was searching for his conscience, Captain John Jack Lee Jr. was looking for a drink. Lee was the quintessential Texas tanker. He was aggressive, foul-mouthed, and had a tactical mind that operated like a sledgehammer. He didn't care about the fine points of European diplomacy. He cared about his tank, his men, and finishing the job so he could go home. His tank was an M4A3E8 Sherman, nicknamed Besotten Jenny. In the spring of 1945, the Sherman was the workhorse of the American armored advance. It wasn't as heavily armored as the German Tigers, but it was fast, reliable, and, in the hands of a man like Jack Lee, it was lethal. Besotten Jenny was scarred by shrapnel, her paint peeling, and her interior smelling of sweat, spent shell casings, and cheap whiskey. She was a beautiful disaster, and she was the only hope the French VIPs had left. When Major Gangl's Kubelwagen approached Lee's position under a white flag, the American GIs didn't see an ally. They saw a target. Lee stood in the turret, a cigar clamped between his teeth, watching the German major climb out of the vehicle. Through the haze of blue smoke, Lee listened to Gangl's story. A castle, high-value prisoners, an SS execution squad on the way. Most officers would have radioed for instructions. They would have waited for a battalion, a recon sweep, and a formal orders package. But Jack Lee wasn't most officers. He looked at the map, then at Gangl, and then at the Besotten Jenny. Well, Lee reportedly muttered, "Let's go have a look." But Lee's superiors weren't as reckless. They only allowed him to take a skeleton crew. Lee's rescue force was laughably small. 7 American soldiers from the 23rd Tank Battalion and the Besotten Jenny itself. Then came the pattern interrupt that stunned Lee's men. Lee looked at Gangl's German soldiers, the same men they had been trying to kill for years, and realized he needed more boots on the ground. He turned to the Germans and gave them a simple choice: fight with us or get out of the way. 14 Wehrmacht soldiers, led by Gangl, stepped forward. To prevent friendly fire from other American units, the Germans tied white pieces of cloth around their left arms. It was a surreal sight. An American Sherman tank leading a convoy of German trucks through the Austrian Alps. As the sun began to set on May 4th, the Besotten Jenny began her climb. The road to Castle Itter was narrow, winding, and flanked by thick forests where SS snipers were known to hide. Every clank of the tank's treads echoed through the valley like a dinner bell for the enemy. Inside the tank, Lee was focused. He knew the odds. He was heading into a kill zone with a handful of Americans and a group of Germans he couldn't fully trust yet. If the SS hit them on the road, they were dead. If the prisoners panicked and started shooting, they were dead. But as the besotten Jenny rounded the final bend and the stone towers of Castle Itter loomed in the moonlight, Jack Lee didn't slow down. He rammed the gate. The savior of France hadn't arrived in a suit or a carriage. He arrived in a grease-stained tank, smelling of tobacco and defiance. But the arrival was the easy part. The sun was about to come up, and with it, the full fury of the Waffen-SS. The Texas tanker was about to find out if besotten Jenny could hold a medieval castle against the best soldiers the Reich had left. May 5th, 1945. 4 a.m., the first light of dawn touches the peaks of the Austrian Alps, turning the snow a pale, ghostly pink. Inside Castle Itter, the air is freezing. Captain Lee has spent the night positioning his meager forces. The besotten Jenny is parked directly in the main gate, her 76mm gun pointing down the only road up the mountain. She is the cork in the bottle. Then, the silence of the mountains is murdered. Crack zip. A single sniper round from the tree line shatters a stone gargoyle just inches from Lee's head. Then comes the saw, the distinctive, terrifying rip of an MG-42, the fastest firing machine gun in the world. It sounds like tearing silk, but it hits like a chainsaw. Thousands of rounds per minute begin to chew into the medieval masonry of the castle. The SS are here. Not just a patrol, but a force of nearly 200 fanatical Waffen-SS troops. They move through the woods like shadows, carrying Panzerfausts, portable anti-tank rockets, specifically designed to turn besotten Jenny into a steel coffin. Return fire, Lee screams. The castle battlements erupt. To the north, American G is lean out of arrow slits with EM-1 Garands. To the east, German Wehrmacht soldiers, Gangl's men, man their positions, firing their Kar 98Ks at their own countrymen. But the most surreal sight is in the second-floor windows. General Maxime Weygand, nearly 80 years old, a man who once commanded millions, is hunkered down behind a stone windowsill with a discarded rifle. Next to him is Paul Reynaud, the former prime minister, frantically reloading magazines. These men, who had spent years blaming each other for France's ruin, are now standing shoulder to shoulder. The political bitterness of a decade is wiped away by the immediate, primal need to stay alive. Boom! Besotten Jenny roars. The muzzle flash lights up the courtyard. A group of SS troops attempting to rush the gate is obliterated. But the SS are professionals. They don't retreat. They adapt. From the tree line, a 20mm flak gun, an anti-aircraft weapon used for ground support, opens up. The shells aren't bullets. They are small explosive bolts. They hammer the Sherman tank. Clang, bang, thud. Inside the tank, the vibration is enough to make a man's ears bleed. Lee watches through his periscope as an SS soldier with a Panzerfaust creeps closer through the tall grass. He tries to traverse the tank's turret, but the Jenny is too big, the road too narrow. Then, the world turns white. A massive explosion rocks the gate. A German 88mm gun, positioned on the opposite ridge, has found its mark. The shell slams into the besotten Jenny. The tank doesn't explode, but it is crippled. Smoke pours from the engine deck. The main gun goes silent. The cork is out of the bottle. Lee and his crew scramble out of the smoking wreck, diving into the castle courtyard just as a hail of machine gun fire sweeps the gate. The defenders are now pushed back into the inner keep. The math is simple and terrifying. The SS have the numbers, they have the heavy weapons, and most importantly, they have the time. The defenders are down to their last crates of ammunition. Every bullet fired is one step closer to the end. Lee looks at Gangl. They both know what's coming. The SS are preparing for a final, all-out assault. If help doesn't arrive in the next hour, Castle Itter won't be remembered as a prison. It will be remembered as a slaughterhouse. But as the SS prepare to charge, a single sniper's scope is centered on the window of the main hall. A finger tightens on a trigger, and the impossible alliance is about to face its most heartbreaking moment. In the middle of a storm, there is sometimes a terrifying, beautiful silence. By mid-morning, Castle Itter had become a furnace of noise and smoke. The defenders were exhausted. Their shoulders ached from the recoil of their rifles, and their eyes stung from the acrid smell of cordite. They were fighting for inches of stone and seconds of life. But amidst this mechanical chaos, a human drama was unfolding that defied every rule of war. Paul Reynaud, the man who had once led France, was not hiding in a cellar. Despite being nearly 70 years old, the former prime minister was gripped by a sudden, defiant energy. He was moving between the windows of the Great Hall, peering out at the tree line, trying to spot the muzzle flashes of the SS attackers. To him, this wasn't just a battle. It was his final chance to strike back at the regime that had stolen 5 years of his life. But Reynaud was a politician, not a soldier. He didn't understand the geometry of death on a battlefield. He was standing too close to the light. He was a silhouette against the dark stone of the castle. And in the forest, 200 yards away, an SS sniper was waiting for exactly that. Major Josef Gangl saw it first. Gangl was positioned near the balcony, coordinating the fire of his Wehrmacht soldiers. He saw the glint of a telescopic sight in the pines. He saw the barrel of the Mauser rifle settle. He looked at Reynaud, the man he had been ordered to keep in chains just days before. In that split second, Gangl didn't see a prisoner. He didn't see a Frenchman. He saw a human life about to be extinguished. Gangl didn't shout a warning. There was no time for words. He lunged. Crack. The sound of the sniper's rifle was different from the rhythmic thud of the machine guns. It was sharp, final. The bullet was intended for the heart of the former Prime Minister of France. Instead, it found the man who had spent his life serving the very army that sent it. Josef Gangl crumpled. He didn't scream. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply fell to the cold stone floor of the castle he had come to save. For a moment, the world of Castle Itter stopped spinning. Captain Lee, seeing his counterpart fall, felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. The German soldiers, Gangl's men, froze. Their commander, the man who had led them through the fires of Russia and the shame of retreat, was gone. And he had died not for the Führer, not for the Reich, but for the life of an enemy. Paul Reynaud stood frozen, looking down at the man in the gray uniform bleeding out at his feet. It is one of the most powerful ironies in military history. A man who wore the Iron Cross gave his last breath to ensure that the man who hated the Iron Cross could live to see a free France. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but in those seconds, the impossible alliance became something more. It was no longer a tactical necessity. It was a blood pact. The defenders didn't surrender. They didn't panic. Instead, a grim, quiet fury took hold of the castle. The German soldiers picked up their rifles with a renewed, desperate energy. They weren't fighting for a lost cause anymore. They were fighting for the memory of the man who had shown them what honor actually looked like. But honor doesn't stop bullets. And as the SS prepared their final rush, the defenders looked at their empty magazines. They were out of time. They were out of ammo. And then, from the valley below, came a sound that didn't belong to the SS. 1 p.m., Castle Itter is a tomb of stone and smoke. Captain Lee is down to his last magazine. The French generals have resorted to throwing stones and using whatever blunt objects they can find. The SS have reached the lower walls. They are preparing the final ladders. They are shouting taunts in the courtyard, knowing that the Americans and their traitors are finished. But then, a vibration starts. It's not the sharp crack of a sniper rifle or the thud of a mortar. It's a low, rhythmic growl that seems to shake the very foundations of the mountain. It's the sound of heavy metal, lots of it, clanking up the winding road. From the battlements, a young American GI screams, "Look! The road!" Bursting through the tree line, like a herd of angry iron beasts, comes the 142nd Infantry Regiment. Leading the charge is a column of M4 Shermans and M10 tank destroyers, their engines screaming at full throttle. Behind them, trucks filled with hundreds of fresh, well-equipped American soldiers. The open loop of Eric Luton's mission is finally closed. The young American runner hadn't just made it to the lines. He had practically dragged the entire regiment back with him. The SS reaction is instantaneous. They aren't just surprised, they are trapped. They were so focused on the golden cage that they forgot they were in a valley surrounded by a collapsing Reich. The American tanks don't stop to negotiate. They open fire with everything they have. The forest edge, where the SS snipers were hiding, disappears in a wall of fire and splinters. The 88mm gun that had crippled Besotten Jenny is silenced by a single, precise shot from an M10. Inside the castle, the defenders watch in stunned silence as the hunters become the hunted. The SS troops who, seconds ago, were prepared to massacre everyone inside, now scramble into the woods. Some throw down their weapons, their hands reaching for the sky. Others are cut down as they try to flee through the tall grass. The Death's Head fanatics, who swore to fight to the last man, find that their resolve vanishes when faced with the overwhelming industrial might of the US Army. The heavy oak gates of Itter are pushed open from the inside. Captain Jack Lee walks out first. His face is black with soot, his uniform torn, a half-burnt cigar still clenched in his teeth. He looks at the lit American tank, then at the smoking wreck of his own Besotten Jenny. The soldiers of the 142nd jump from their trucks, expecting to find a pile of corpses. Instead, they find one of the strangest sights in the history of warfare. They see American GIs hugging German Wehrmacht soldiers. They see French prime ministers shaking hands with Texas tank crews. They see a battlefield where the lines of enemy and ally have been blurred into a single, exhausted group of survivors. But as the cheers erupt and the tension breaks, the reality of the cost sets in. The rescue was a success. The VIPs were saved. But the man who had made it all possible, the man in the gray uniform who had chosen honor over his own life, was being carried out on a makeshift stretcher. The battle was over. But the story of what this alliance meant for the future of Europe was just beginning. The guns of Castle Itter fell silent on the afternoon of May 5, 1945. For the SS, the dream of a 1,000-year Reich ended in a humiliating surrender in the mud of an Austrian courtyard. Nearly 100 fanatical soldiers were taken prisoner by a combined force of Americans and their own former comrades. For the French WWII, the nightmare was over. Paul Reynaud and Edouard Daladier, who had entered the castle as bitter rivals, left as survivors. They would return to a liberated France, where they would continue to argue, continue to lead, and continue to shape the future of Europe. But they would never forget the man in the gray uniform who died so they could have that chance. Captain Jack Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his extraordinary heroism. He returned to Texas, lived a long life, and became a legend in the annals of the 12th Armored Division. He was a man who didn't set out to make history. He just set out to do his job. And his job, as it turned out, was to orchestrate the impossible. But the true soul of this story lies in a quiet corner of the town of Würgel. Today, if you walk through that town, you will find a street named Sepp Gangl-Strasse. It is named after Josef Gangl. He is honored as a national hero in Austria, not for the battles he won for the Wehrmacht, but for the one battle he fought against it. Think about the choice Josef Gangl made. He was a decorated officer. He had a family. He had a reputation. He could have played it safe. He could have stayed in his headquarters, waited for the Americans to arrive, and surrendered with his dignity intact. Instead, he chose the path of the traitor. He chose to put on his uniform one last time to fight against the very machine he had served for years. He chose to protect enemies because he realized that human life has a value that transcends borders, flags, and ideologies. History often remembers the great conquerors, the brilliant tacticians, and the powerful dictators. But the battle for Castle Itter reminds us that history is also made by the individuals who refuse to follow orders when those orders are wrong. It reminds us that even in the darkest hour of the most brutal war in human history, the light of human conscience can still find a way to shine. So, I leave you with one question. If you were standing on that forest road on May 4th, 1945, if you were wearing that gray uniform, and you knew that doing the right thing would cost you everything, your rank, your reputation, and likely your life, would you have the courage to reach out your hand? Josef Gangl did, and because he did, the strangest battle of World War II became its most meaningful victory.